Very excited to be with you for our conversation today around the power of technology and data. And I want to start with a topic that I know all three of you deal with, and probably most of you in the audience deal with as well, which is around regulations and reporting and the challenges and intensity that that can take. So Ben, I want to start with you on this. When you're working with your clients on their disclosures and their reporting, how are you thinking about how you can use things like technology, generative AI, to help streamline some of that very data-intensive process?
That's a great question, Lauren. I mean, we've been waiting for this moment for probably 20 years in the corporate sustainability world, solidifying consistent requirements on companies. So the upside for the world is more transparency, and we're clearly seeing companies having to think about what we would call foundational sustainability work for the first time. So thinking about climate risk, thinking about greenhouse gas inventories, thinking about nature risk assessment, water, pollution, etc. It's very far-reaching, particularly in the EU. The danger, of course, is that distracts, the compliance effort distracts from the real work, if I can call it that, of delivering sustainable outcomes. And we're actually seeing some clients actually having to divert resources. But I think inherently, technology has got to play a big part in that. We don't want to end up in a few years of having huge manual industries. And in fact, I would argue we don't have time and we don't have the skills. So technology and data needs to be part of that. Whether it's data mapping tools right at the start, CSRD in Europe, there's over 100 disclosure requirements, over 1,000 data points companies need to get to. But generative AI is quite interesting as well. We're starting to look at that in the reporting side. And then from an assurance point of view, how we use AI to spot, all of the multiple complex correlations that would spot an issue. So I think our message to companies is don't wait to think about technology and data after you've figured out what you need to do. Bring technology and data right up front in that project.
And Raed, how do you contextualize what you're sharing? Obviously, there's stuff that's required and mandatory. But there's a lot that's still voluntary as well. So as you're putting out this data, people don't always have the full picture, right? How do you think about how much you share, the way that you share, so that people really understand that full story?
Well, that's a very good point, and you need to have a two-way communication with your stakeholders and understand what level of information do they need and what do they need it for, so that you would enable their own decision-making as well. And this ranges from government to shareholders as well to locals within the area. It's been really very important for us from the beginning to understand when we communicate this and the information that we have is, one, understand what they need to know, but also understand that they need to know what is the starting point for any ambition, what is the starting point for us in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the challenges, in terms of the existing stresses on the environment, as well as the socioeconomic situation of when you start to develop for a giga project. But as you also need, in terms of transparency, to tell them where you're heading, and to tell them what is your level of ambition, how do you envision achieving that, and you need to demonstrate action on the ground. People need to see and understand that you're taking steps towards achieving that ambition. Where are you, and what are the challenges that you're dealing with? Without providing all of that to the people are much more knowledgeable than they used to be before. I mean the use of technical terms, for example. My 12-year-old son now understands much more about sustainability than I used to understand when I was 12 years old. So people understand these technical terms. People understand now the global challenges in terms of environment protection, regeneration, and sustainability. So I think we benefit from that in the way that when we communicate, we don't have to tell a lot, but we need to cover everything for them to understand the full context.
Daniel, I want to bring you in on this point that he just brought up around kind of the language and understanding in this space. When you're talking to a private equity client or financial service client, and you're talking about ESG, are people speaking the same language?
That is an interesting point you're actually raising over here, because ESG is a very broad topic. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there's a myriad of different interpretations in there. There's a myriad of different understandings in there. And there's ultimately a myriad of different approaches down there. What does this ultimately translate into? This more like means that people out there, private equity firms, but also financial institutions, just like everybody out in the market, pursues what they more like think is best. But we need to be coming from a technological perspective. On the one hand, we need to have a common level playing field. We need to more like speak all the same language. We need to focus on the same aspects to more like drive this initiative drive this ESG journey of all of ours going forward to the extent that it makes most sense to us. Now, bearing that in mind, there's a certain shift also in here, which perhaps even complicates it further. I think historically, ESG has been a little bit more on the risk management side. This is much more turning outwards focused, much more focused on perceiving ESG as an opportunity to have impact, an opportunity to create value going forward, and an opportunity to drive this ultimately. So all of that in mind, language ultimately is the common factor. It is important that we do have a level playing field where everybody has the same starting point and that we do talk about the same things.
And how do you think we get more of a common language? Is that a responsibility of governments, of firms, of ratings agencies? I mean, who is responsible for getting us to a more common language there?
I think there's different viewpoints you can ultimately take on this aspect. I think we as a society need to further define and clarify as to where we basically want to go. For the time being, everybody's trying and is out there with their very best effort, and I think that's perfectly fine. Over time, however, new technologies will emerge. Over time, we will have new ideas, new thought pathways, and so on. But bearing in mind what the ultimate goal is, net zero by 2050, for instance, there is certain pathways we can be pursuing from here onwards, and that in mind, certain ideas will emerge.
If I may add to that, I mean, one of the best advantages and the best achievements of international regulations in particular and international policymakers is establishing this common language, because all of these terms, technical terms, are defined. The baseline is defined, and in terms of pathways, as you've described, these pathways are also defined, and so that creates a common language globally. And there is also a common language that needs to be established locally as well. And when you work, when you are working with a particular community or on a particular geographical area, there is common language that you need to tap into to understand your situation, to understand, where you're operating, what are you impacting. But also when you communicate to people as well in the language they already use and they already understand.
Ben, I want to go back to a point that you raised in the first question around cannibalization of efforts and kind of how do you keep regulation from being something that's taking away from actual value creation or actual sustainability progress? What are the best ways to do that?
Well, probably two bits to the answer. I think first of all is how companies can use data and tech was part of the first answer, but the technology market around sustainability is very fast moving, and there's a lot of players moving into it. There's a lot of venture capital money backing new data providers and aggregators, etc. We've invested significantly in our alliance relationships with strategic partners such as IBM, Microsoft, SAP, because every company has in some form those enterprise systems, and our first message is use what you have. A couple of simple examples. Our Scope 3 emissions related to travel is our biggest environmental impact. Arguably, other than office footprint. So, driving behavior change was really important to us. We already had travel systems. We already had booking systems. But embedding a carbon calculator into the booking system to allow people to think about not just cost, but actually the carbon impact has driven down emissions quite significantly, so that behavior change. And then the other one, working with IBM around a system called Maximal, which is an asset management system. That's been around for decades to help companies think about safety and cost management around their asset base. We've worked with them to build a sustainability lens to it. So when you're making decisions about replacing equipment or maintenance around equipment, there's also a carbon impact. Carbon intensity has a direct relationship to cost and, guess what, to safety. So it's just thinking a bit differently and building in sustainability use cases. The second part, if I could just build that in, is also thinking about where you're going to get the skills from. Because if you take highly trained environmental scientists and engineers and get them doing spreadsheets and checklists for compliance, that's clearly the wrong answer. Mm-hmm. So we see a lot of companies coming to us now and asking us actually for managed service. How do we get data operations? How do we get business operations run as a seamless operation rather than distracting? And for us, that's quite a nice mission to help companies focus on what they should be doing, which is that sustainability project.
Raed, I want to bring you in on this point that Ben raised around nudging and behavior change, right? You are dealing with a massive pool of stakeholders. If you think about all the people that you're working with on the ground, all the governments you're working with, entities you're working with, people, like you have to deal with a huge pool. So how are you thinking about using technology or using data to drive more understanding?
Well, it's really a big challenge, and it is, the technology does come to the aid. Post-COVID, and where we exist now in Saudi, on the west coast of Saudi, on the Red Sea, post-COVID, people now, even the Bedouins and the camel carriers within our region, have smartphones, and even if they are illiterate or cannot read Arabic or English, they have learned how to use a smartphone, they have learned how to access it and how to open a certain app. So we've capitalized on this, and we are launching very soon an app of our own just to communicate with the locals and have two-way communication with them. This enables us to collect a lot more data and a lot more information from the people, because they are our best asset to understand the situation, to understand the environment, and to understand that interaction and that engagement. How is the Giga project impacting their lives? What aspect of their lives are being impacted, and how do we manage any potential negative impacts, and how do we capitalize on any opportunities? All of that we cannot learn without having that level of communication. We are engaging with a lot of stakeholders, from the government level, from the private sector, from partners as well, and with scientists and engineers. And I loved what you mentioned into that it's not the answer to give the scientists or the engineers the spreadsheets and the data to deliver on. Separation and a good governance and separation between the people who need to plan and the people who need to implement and the people who need to check. I think that separation is key, and then directing that communication between the stakeholders and the relevant internal stakeholder, I think is also key. The planning people need to understand how what is on the ground at the moment is impacting their lives. How are we impacting the environment at the moment? Deployment of all of the sensors, more than 2,700 sensors that are automatically collecting information from the environment around us. They need that information to guide their planning, but also the people on the ground implementing need also that information to guide, to adjust and tweak what they do to minimize any negative impacts, and also the opportunities on the strategic level. All of these opportunities are emerging from conversations with people, from conversations with partners.
I think that's a really interesting example that you give around the technology use of the app and how you're bringing in the community. Was that a difficult process to get there, or were they immediately ready to uptake on this? How did you go through that process of bringing the community in?
We want to use smartphones and apps, and people now have easy access to those to communicate with two main stakeholders. One is the locals within where the Giga project exists. This is because we want to continue. We have learned so much from them 4 or 5 years ago when we started the planning phase. We want to continue to learn from them on how do we coexist and how do we add and benefit. The ambition is to go beyond sustainability, and the ambition is to go into regenerative tourism. And in order for you to do that, you need to be guided by your stakeholders and the environment, and where are the opportunities that you can invest your resources so that you add to improving people's livelihood, to improving people's lives, and also improving the environment and enhancing the environment. All of that is only happening through that communication. But also on the other side, with tourists, future tourists, that will be visiting our destination, communication is also key. The tourist needs to, for them to be part of the journey that we have started, for them to be part of the regenerative tourism model, they need to understand how are they interacting with that within their environment. Red Sea project, for example, and the Amala project, both projects are in a pristine location of high conservation value. They are Giga projects, they are not small projects. And tourists who will visit this area, they need to understand how are they being part of the story. And in order for them to really feel and understand and believe that, we need to share some information with them on a daily basis, and they need to have opportunities as well to contribute to that regeneration.
Daniel, I imagine you get pitched all the time by companies or new technologies, being brought to you. How do you decide where to put your time, your effort? How do you decide where to direct clients?
Look, I think from our perspective, the world has changed. As stupid and as common as it basically may sound. I think the world nowadays is much more complex than it used to be. and it does require integrated solutions. So bearing that in mind, that's ultimately our guiding framework over here. Like, where do we have white spots? Where do the clients need more of certain specific skill sets? There is no one singular ESG expert out there. There is no one singular party which can cover it all. So it's more about taking an integrator approach and looking into how can you plug into the right parties, who has value to add, who can solve very specific challenges, who does more like fit into your clients, but also, of course, into your own network from a value perspective, from an outline perspective, from a scaling perspective, from a technological and innovation perspective. So there's a number of different elements. Of course, we also need to bear in mind that is it financeable, is it feasible for the client over here? Because the best solution is not going to solve any issue if it's not for the market and not to be financed.
Ben, I want to ask you the same question. If a technology comes across your desk or you hear about a new startup in the sustainability tech space, what are you looking for? What catches your eye?
Yeah, we do get approached a lot, and it's a very exciting market, but it's a very confusing market, I would say. So we've followed a similar approach. I think the one Daniel described. We've got very clear integrated solutions that we are focused on helping clients. So decarbonization, sustainable supply chain, sustainable consumer innovation, etc. So we've got a blueprint that we're fitting within. We know where we're interested to open up. I'd say the criteria, is something around clearly distinctive capability, but also I think in this space of sustainability, the thing that turns us off most is when someone is trying to be really smart with a proprietary method, for example, in greenhouse gas baselining, and taking a deviation from standards that are out there. I think this is uniquely a space where we need to work together and collaborate, and we need to share and open source as much as possible. We need to back big initiatives like Science-Based Targets Initiative, or get behind the ISSB, CSRD. The language point is well made. I think there's a lot of definition and criteria that are actually becoming quite helpful, but already we're talking to clients in the details, and they're like, yeah, but what does that really mean in practice? And I think this is where we've got to not come up with our own definitions, but actually work with the standard setters and work with the open initiatives to create commonality. So from a startup perspective, for us, it's those that are using, taking what they can from the open market, finding smart ways of accelerating client journeys, using emerging technology in a smart way, particularly AI is obviously hot right now, super hot, and plugging into a specific client need that's really well defined.
We've talked a decent amount about challenges, so I want us to all focus on something really positive. So I'm going to go to each of you. I want you to give me an example of either a technology that you are using or your clients have using, something that you feel like has really benefited your sustainability efforts. So give us a positive example of where you're seeing this actually really come to life. Raed, I'll start with you.
Well, we are on the lookout for technologies to be adopted in our destinations, and we are taking risks. We are taking bold moves into adopting these technologies, even the ones that need piloting and need testing. But we have so much technologies now and available scanning technologies. For example, drone scanning that is driven by AI. Underwater for scanning our corals, for example. So we don't need to wait for years, 5 years or 10 years to understand how are we interacting with the corals, or what we are our methods for enhancing the corals. What are the real benefits for that? We are now measuring corals at the level of millimeter in terms of growth. That tells us within the span of 1 year how effective the methods and the applications that we're applying to the coral is really enhancing them or implementing them. We can very quickly understand what is the performance and what is the real efficiency of the methods that we're deploying, so that we can change it, adopt it, tweak it to achieve better results moving forward. We don't have to wait decades now.
That's very cool. Is that possible? So you see something in a year and you're like, okay, this isn't working. Like, about face, let's do something different. Even
less than a year. I mean, in order for us to coexist with the pristine environment, we had to up the ante on the monitoring. The monitoring is not your standard monitoring for any developer within the marine environment. We exist in an area that houses one of the most beautiful coral reefs in the world. And we understand that this is a huge responsibility on our shoulders. So the monitoring equipment that we deploy is at a scale that has never been seen before. We even now went beyond the monitoring into feeding that information into the drones to understand not only are we in compliance or not in terms of what are the levels of pollution, for example. No, we're trying to understand how are we enhancing the environment on the coral, moving coral, adding more sunlight, the floating nurseries that we've developed on site. These are floating nurseries that are an innovative approach into growing coral. We adjust the height, the depth actually of the floating nursery. We adjust the oxygen levels. We adjust all of the nutrients level. We adjust the sunlight reaching the coral. All of these tweaks helps us to understand what is the optimum conditions for our investment to achieve most of the best results.
That's really exciting. Great examples. Daniel, over to you. Give us some positive examples.
I mean, look, it's Schneider Electric. And Schneider Electric is a huge company with almost 300,000 employees with this like huge and deep engineering expertise on the one hand, but also the advisory bit on the other hand. I don't even know where to start with solutions over here. We can talk about physical solutions from smart metering for real estate, like perhaps a little bit more scope 1 focused, where we very much can help clients to become more efficient, to electrify ultimately on their journey. But it can also be scope 2 solutions, where we can support you with novel solutions in terms of how can you get PPAs enacted, like we do have a huge network with utility companies, for instance. We have also our solutions on the supply chain side, for instance, which is we have undergone the entire exercise ourselves. And it's a monumental task in all fairness. It's still ongoing and it will be ongoing like it is for the most of the world ongoing at this point in time. So there's a lot of different ways from data solutions, electrification solutions, efficiency solutions I want to point out over here and which are very important.
Fantastic. Ben,
yeah.
Same question to you.
Well, I love the fact that I hear regenerative business mentioned a lot, and this is clearly the goal, to move to regenerative, not just incremental kind of improvements. We need to move fast. And I love Raed's example of using tech, 2,700 sensors, because a lot of the technology and a lot of what companies struggle with is a little bit is understanding the context in which they operate, particularly if they've got remote locations. What is their footprint in largest possible sense? So let me give you an example, and I'm not sure how many people would know that EY's in the space game, but we've invested in space technology, working with some of the agencies to help companies map their operations. So what better way of looking at their planetary impact than looking at the planet and zooming in? So for example, working with some mining companies in Australia where it's not just about environmental impact, water scarcity, vegetation management, but it's also about the relationship between climate, nature, and human rights. So some of the nature projects for the mining companies are, buying up land with indigenous stakeholders. And it's really, really important. You've seen some of the cases where that's gone wrong, that they understand literally the physical space in which they're operating and understanding the creeping and accelerating impact of climate change, what they can do on nature, and then the impact on indigenous villages. The worst possible cases are where, a company inadvertently has a nature project which is run by a third party and then impacts on indigenous stakeholders because they're, for example, pushed out of land that is then being used for regeneration. So that's just one example. You'd never think of it like space tech, but actually it's a very practical way of thinking about context for companies.
Daniel, how do you think about the need for collaboration, working across industry, potentially working with competitors, the value of data and information sharing? How do you balance that with what's good for your business?
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, it's relatively simple. What's good for our clients is good for the business, is good for everybody in that respect. We do partner with a lot of different companies. It more like goes back to the white space approach, like how can we function as an integrator, whom can we bring in to solve very specific challenges so that we do take the complexity for our clients out of the game, but instead ultimately operate as a one-stop shop solution provider. It's almost like an EPC project nowadays. With all these different huge monumental challenges ahead, how can we help you? who needs to be coming in, and how do we fill the white spots?
Right, similar question to you. How do you think about how you differentiate yourselves from others? You know, while you want to share data, you obviously it's key to your success, key to the communities. How do you decide what you share? How do you decide where you share the best practices, but also say these are the things that are going to make us special and different?
Maybe one of the things on the global level, one of the things that are unique maybe in Saudi at the moment is that it's just becoming a hub, and we're working with everybody. We're working with Ernst & Young, we're working with many leading organizations, we're working with scientists, we're partnering with them, and we're becoming a catalyst and enabling entrepreneurs to test their technologies and apply them to where we exist. In terms of sharing information, I think one of the unique situations that we're in is the government's approach into bottom-up regulations, into finding out the development of reporting rules and regulations and the procedures. The standards for doing that internally, nationally within Saudi, is being built bottom up. I mean, regulations are by definition one size that fits all, but it doesn't have to be all the way. I mean, on the high level, yes, maybe, but at the level of detail and level how do you comply, you need to have the freedom and you need to have the say into what makes best sense for you and your own situation. One of the good examples is camel grazing, for example. Camel grazing, uncontrolled camel grazing, is one of the stresses on the environment where we exist. Banning camel grazing or building a fence is definitely not the solution. And so you need to work with the camel owners, and you need owning camels is very important into the culture of the locals. So you need to work with them, you need to communicate with them, and you need to find specific solutions that do work with them. We do not have to tell them what they have or do not have to do. We take the solutions from them, and we need to take the needs from them, and then we just become an enabler for them to have a better, more environmentally friendly grazing for their camels. That we can coexist. That giga project, a beautiful environment, that a thriving environment, and also them with the culture, with the camels. All of them can coexist if we just establish that dialogue. And we don't need top-down approaches to enforce any regulations. We need to listen, and we need to develop solutions. When we have the tools, we have the experts to develop those solutions that work for them.
It's a great example of learning from nature and learning from the pre-existing environment that's there. Ben, you're in a highly competitive industry, right? So similarly, how are you thinking about using tech to differentiate yourselves? How do you think about what makes you special in the space?
Yeah, and so we believe that tech and data is going to be the clear enabler. So that's why we've invested so much in both alliances, our own technology development, and supporting external initiatives as well, as I said earlier. So for us, it's about taking enterprise solutions, but we are investing heavily in enabling content, accelerators. You've kind of got a core platform, but the way in which those are used, the examples around sustainability use cases, analytics, workflow, using AI, that's all what you might call partner content, and that's where we're contributing to the agenda.
We have 1 more minute together, so I want to hear from you each very quickly. What's a technology you'd love to see? What's something you would be excited to see growth in the future? Ben, you first.
Well, I wonder what quantum will do. We talk a lot about Gen AI. I mean, quantum could, for a start, cut down massively the emissions footprint of the energy consumption today of all of the data centers and all the tech, because it's going to be hugely more efficient. But inevitably, how quickly will we then ramp up use? And there'll be a kind of feedback loop and a consequence. So it'll be really interesting to see how, if we can, significantly reduce the emissions of technology through the use of quantum.
Daniel, what about you?
First of all, I actually very much agree with this aspect, but to perhaps not pick on the same one, I would probably more go into the generative AI direction as to how it can develop as an enabler going forward, how it can be fundamental in developing new processes, new ideas as to how we can turn our existing processes more efficient.
Raed?
For me and for the context in terms of tourism and development, I would love to see technology playing a part that takes us from the very good example that you used in terms of how adding a carbon calculator to when you go and book your flight, to something that really tells the people how are they contributing and how are they interacting with the environment. Knowledge is the key, and if we are able to deliver that knowledge to anybody, to kids, to locals, to Bedouins, to the fishermen, and to everybody, if you are able to deliver that information on its own and to give them the understanding of what's their long-term, measurable, verifiable impact on the environment, behavioral change will happen, and people will change and will choose the right the right option. They will choose to do best for their environment and for their own people. People take care of their home, they take care of each other, and they take care of the environment. We only need to enable that. And if we can have the technology that takes them from a simple calculator or simple add-on to an exercise that they do and makes it part of their life to understand how they interact with the environment over long term, I think that's key for success globally.
Raed, Daniel, and Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.